Hello everyone. As I mentioned in my post on Canvas, this week I'm going to give you an introduction to business journalism, and I hope many of you were not startled or became or had any kind of sense of fear about it. I think it's really important for us to know some things about business journalism. Um, I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit more explanation of the reasons why it's important, and as well as some of the history of it, and then how we should be writing business stories. I think this will serve as a good framework for you when you are working on your current event stories. Now, I'm going to post something about that too, about how you need to be doing those. So look for that after listening to this. But you will basically, for your current news, you're going to be focusing on business news. And business news, it's a number of things. It can even, it's from anything from the stock market, which is usually what people think about when they think of business journalism. But it's also about the new mom and pop store opening somewhere, maybe in Murray. Those are news stories as well. So anyway, let's get right down to it and talk about business journalism, and specifically, why should we study it? Well, as I mentioned to you, I want to make sure that when you get ready to graduate from this program, that you have some marketable skills. Even though you may have your sight set on a certain path in your news career or your public relations career, sometimes you just don't know what can happen. Likewise, you don't know what your job might entail. Just because you might be, say, a general assignment reporter at a news organization, you could be one day covering a city council meeting, and then maybe another week you're focusing on education. All of those have ties and some sort of foundation in business journalism. So, having said that, that's why I find it really important for you to have these skills. I know it is a future endeavor of this department, the Journalism Mass Communication Department at Murray State, to maybe one day have a business journalism sequence, or maybe some sort of a certificate, or maybe even a degree program. I don't know. We are trying to still build some things in that. And one of the ways to do it is to start just incorporating into the curriculum, when we can and where we can, some elements about business journalism. Just some factual information to support my claim as to, again, why you should need to know business journalism. Because I told you in the Canvas post that editors want that from our graduates. Well, that's confirmed by a 2002 survey. It was the American Press Institute and the Reynolds Foundation. The Reynolds Foundation has a strong tie to business journalism. They are a large advocate of the field. And of course, that's where I received my training and, for the fellowship in 2014. News executives say hiring business reporters is the hardest beat for which to find qualified workers. And again, it's because of the numbers. We all come into this program because we do like to write. We might be fascinated by all the new technology that's inherent in the field of journalism and public relations, but we can't ignore numbers, nor can we ignore financial concepts. They are too much of a realistic components of our field, so we cannot ignore them. In addition, business journalism began to heighten really after 2001. That's when we started to see Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, and there were a number of other companies. They began having some financial problems, and a lot of those were unraveled in the media. And then our interest in journalism, business journalism, increased around 2008, 2009 with the recession. There's still large interest in business journalism because now we are starting to pull out of the recession. And so that's why it's really important now to watch various market trends as well as just what's going on in our local communities. I believe in the undergraduate program, we don't really offer a journalism history course, and it's understandable as to why we don't. Now, on the graduate level, there is a course in the history of journalism. I find it important to try to establish some sort of historical framework for you And we've talked a little bit about, say, convergence and how news media have evolved over time, and I think that's important to study a little bit. And I'm going to do the same here for business journalism. I think you need to know how the trend has been in the last several decades. It actually goes back a long time before just decades. You know, when Europeans were making their way to the now United States, newspapers were still their source of information, especially for the agricultural community. That's where they could find the crop and livestock prices, which ships had entered the port, and the goods that those ships contained. Newspapers around the 19th century really started to concentrate on business news. So we have the Wall Street Journal, for instance, in 1889 being formed and launched. We still saw a lot of important business news in some of the mainstream papers, but the Wall Street Journal, the Journal of Commerce, those focus solely on business journalism. And then throughout the late 1890s and then early part of the 20th century, many newspapers started to have their reporters investigating how companies were affecting the lives of people. So, for example, in 1899, you had the Chicago Daily Tribune. They started to publish stories about how firecrackers, for instance, those are used, of course, to celebrate July 4th, but they were seeing some sort of trend in which it was killing large numbers of people every year. So their stories, that coverage, helped to prompt restrictions on how fireworks were made and sold. And this is a phenomenon that we continue to see in media, about how media tend to really help situate various recalls. They help to do some sort of reform. We also saw that in the yellow journalism era. So again, this just shows how important business journalism is with trying to help persuade policymakers on what needs to be done. Journalists also started to watch investments because they were noticing, for instance, around in 1920, some financial wrongdoings going on of Charles Ponzi. He was the financial expert. He promised huge returns to investors. Again, another phenomenon we continue to see today. And this is where the term Ponzi scheme, and you've probably heard of that. Well, that's where that derives, is from that incident in 1920. Business journalism then expanded to consumer news. So not only were we reporting on things happening in the early part of the around the 19th century and then going to investments, financial wrongdoings, but now we have consumer news in which we were trying to help buyers purchase safer products, and we would have stories about that. An example was Ralph Nader, and you might have heard of him as well. 1959, he was a reporter for The Nation, consumer advocate, actually. He investigated automobile safety, and that led to new federal regulations on seat belts, recalls, crash tests, airbags, etc. BizJ, we call it BizJ just for short, for business journalism, it continued to evolve. And so today we now have wire service devoted to business journalism with Bloomberg News, for instance. You also have the Dow Jones, you have Reuters. So all of these have some sort of rich concentration in business journalism. Because business journalism was starting to, for lack of better words, get some attention and getting things done that really helped the mass market, corporate executives weren't too happy with business journalism reporters. They were, in a lot of ways, blaming mass media for some of these problems. And so then you had the rise of public relations in the 50s and 60s. A lot of organizations and companies, especially in the corporate America at that time, were establishing PR departments, so that way they could try to spin a lot of the negative reactions that were coming from their publics. 1980s and 1990s became better for the business journalism field. However, we were starting to see a question of ethics come along. Business reporters were becoming investors themselves. And most of the time they were doing it because they were trying to explore more into their story. But the thing is, they would not disclose their sources. Sometimes also they were leaking information before articles were published. So that raised some ethical concerns for us, and it was actually damaging our credibility. Overall, news outlets were missing still some business news. And over time, we started to see the quality of business news beginning to suffer. Now, the problem we have today is still perception. But, really deep down, people want better business coverage. People want to know how to save money more effectively. They want to know how to spend money more effectively. They want to know how to invest their money more effectively. So people are interested in this. That's why we have Dave Ramsey. That's why we have Susie Orman. And that's why you have CNN Money. All of these media personalities and outlets really focusing on the individual. People want to know what to do with their money, and they're turning to the media for that context. Now, we are going to cover some of these concepts that you see here, like revenue and net income. Okay, there are differences between the two. And I'm trying to think, actually, I might not have you all know this. I can't really remember. But there is a difference between revenue and net income. Revenue is everything that's brought in. Net income is what's left over after paying the bills. Okay, so there are differences. You'll be surprised how many reporters will actually use those terms interchangeably, and they're not one and the same. You also have to have an understanding about the ins and outs of business. A lot of this understanding is going to come much later in your career should you decide to pursue this path. You're not going to know it this semester, I promise you that. We're just going to discuss some basic concepts about business journalism. But the bottom line with all of this is that business and the economy are related to everything. Everything. The gadgets you use, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, the place you live. It's all related to business and the economy. So whether you realize it or not, you actually are impacted by a lot of this. Now, we've discussed some of the history, the building blocks of business journalism. This is where I really want those basic concepts to start. And I think it's important to know, maybe to differentiate a public company and a private company. You probably have seen this a lot already in the news, especially if you follow Twitter. Twitter is actually a public company. What's a public company? Well, it's a company that sells stock to the public. And then that stock is traded on an exchange. All public companies must file their information, lots of information, financial information, as well as anytime they have a leadership change on the board or if they have a new CEO, they have to file that information with what's known as the SEC. Now, I know I love college basketball as much as some of you do. I love it, okay? And I know we are rooted heavily in basketball country here in West Kentucky and throughout the Commonwealth. So SEC in business journalism context does not mean the Southeastern Conference, okay? SEC, as it applies to business journalism, is Securities and Exchange Commission, all right? Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission has an open online portal in which now reporters, they can get all the public information about these companies that's on there. So anytime a public company makes a filing to the SEC, it is public. Reporters can access it, even you can access it. Now, private companies are not required to file such documents. They don't have to. That's why they're private. Your private company's examples, well, look in Murray or wherever you might be. You have your mom and pop's small proprietorship type stores, maybe some small eateries. Polly Eyes Pizza, for instance, on Chestnut Street. That is a private business. But public companies or private companies, it doesn't matter. They are driven and they measure their success by how much their sales increase or how much their revenue increases and their improved profits, okay, which is basically the net income in this case. Now, sometimes public and private companies can interact with each other. Public companies might sell their products and services to private companies and vice versa. In fact, it happens all the time. So in addition to Twitter, here are some examples of other public companies that you may or may not have known. Nike, Coca-Cola, Dell, Microsoft, The Gap, General Motors, Chevron. The New York Times is a public media company. And the WWE, for all those wrestling fans out there, believe it or not, it is a public company. So you can go to the Securities and Exchange Commission website and you can find how well those companies are performing at any given time, pretty much, in their calendar. Sometimes it might take a while for filings to occur because even though, for instance, let's say a company concludes its business, let's say they operate on a calendar year. So let's say, for instance, the WWE measures its success yearly and their calendar ended December 31st, 2014. We still might not see that filing for maybe another month or so, okay? Because they're still trying to get a lot of the information compiled, some last minute things taken care of. So sometimes it can take a few months for filings to occur. But you can at least look at the most recent filings and you can even go back in their history. So that way you can see some trends as to whether that public company is a sound one or not. Now let's look a little bit more at the SEC, again, Securities and Exchange Commission. Like I said, that public companies are regulated by this agency. It's a federal agency. It was created in the 1930s, pretty much in response to a lot of the Ponzi schemes going on at that time too, as well as just other bad investments. But it was designed to provide protection for investors against unscrupulous companies who were duping people into buying worthless stock. Now, it requires these companies to provide information that anyone can read. Okay, again, it's financial performance documents that are filed every quarter, and then documents also that must disclose important events. And I've mentioned some of these already. For instance, CEO changes. Anytime they want to buy another company, they have to file that. Mergers. So, for instance, in 2014, we had Comcast announcing it was going to buy Time Warner. So paperwork was filed and all of the sale on that is still pending, kind of, even though I think it's already taken effect, but we're slowly starting to see some of those changes, especially if you're on Time Warner Cable. The website you can access to see a lot of these documents, again, they're public. It's sec.gov. Okay, that's simple to remember, sec.gov. Some companies also provide access to their documents on their own websites. For instance, one of the things that has to be filed to the SEC is the annual report. Okay, it's also known as the 10K. These, primarily the annual reports, they're posted. Many companies share those on their websites. However, the annual reports sometimes they become a PR tool. So it's more of a dog and pony show at that point, in that the company is only going to highlight certain things that they really want the public to know. But nevertheless, the official documents that show the good, bad, and the ugly have to be filed with the SEC. So what does SEC really do with all of these filings? Well, they do review these. It's not just that public companies have to file them. These filings are reviewed. They are reviewed by 5 commissioners who are appointed by the U.S. President. And the SEC investigates companies to see if they have any suspicions about some possible violations. So if something doesn't look right in those reports, they're going to start investigating. The SEC Commission can levy fines or they can set restrictions on that company. In addition to reviewing those reports, the SEC also writes rules when it feels that maybe some new regulations are needed. And sometimes they can just be reflecting on the new direction or a new trend in business. Now, once a rule is proposed, then companies are invited to comment on those. So it's not just that the SEC just makes decisions. They have proposals, and then public companies can comment on those. And again, the public can see all of these comments. So all of this is transparent. Now there are many actually SEC regulations, but as far as they pertain to us as news professionals and public relations practitioners, there are two that are really important for us to know. Okay, one is what's called as regulation fair disclosure. That became in 2000, so it's still relatively recent. I mean, 14, 15 years. Now, this requires public companies to provide information to every investor at the same time. Okay, so sometimes this is where we hear those investor earnings conference calls. Okay, you may have heard some sort of terminology around those. Reporters can listen to these. Okay, so sometimes when they know a company is getting ready to provide information to their investors, they do it through some sort of teleconference. All right, so they do it at the same time. It can't be that they just call one investor or a group of investors and then another. No, it has to be done at the same time. They set up a time. Investors who want to listen, they call in, probably dial in some sort of code, and then there you go. Reporters are given that same information. Okay. Reporters also can attend presentations at investor conference meetings, read those filings. Again, it's all because of the regulation fair disclosure. Now, the second SEC regulation you need to know is that each public company must hold an annual meeting of its shareholders. In fact, you may have gone to, if your parent or your spouse or significant other, if they work for a public company, maybe you have attended an annual meeting. Sometimes some public companies make this a fun dinner or maybe a fun family outing, but they have some sort of annual meeting of its shareholders. And the invitation to the shareholders must be made in the form of an SEC filing. Okay, again, these filings are sent to every shareholder, and it does not matter how many shares you own. It could be just one share. But even if you own that one share in that public company, you are given that invitation. A lot of times they'll have the meetings near the company's headquarters. If a company, say for instance, maybe Coca-Cola, because they have several main offices, they might rotate those among their various locations. Now, SEC nor any other federal law really requires the public companies to notify reporters, but a lot of them notify the reporters anyway because especially if they've got some good things to announce, then they're going to want the news media there. What happens at annual meetings? Well, business will be discussed. Like I said, generally, most of the time it's in the format of a dinner. This is where new board members are formally voted on. You may have some auditors elected. Shareholders might vote on proposals. They can also make proposals. And all of those are detailed in the invitation if there are any. Now, sometimes there aren't any proposals. A lot of times it's just more of just a large gathering and let's just formally celebrate the outgoing of board members and the incoming of new board members. So that's usually the way it goes. But proposals can be voted on or it can be made. And if those are going to happen, it must be in the invitation. And that part of it is known as the proxy statement. Now, for us in journalism, these can make good stories because the public company must also provide feedback to the proposal, and sometimes conflict can occur. So I haven't come across any to give you examples of it, but it can happen. So just know that shareholders have opportunities. It's not just the company, it's the shareholders who have opportunities to effect some sort of change. Now let's kind of shift our attention to private companies. You may have seen, we all know about these, Chrysler, Mars Candy, Publix, the grocery store, Toys R Us, that's even private. Private companies, like I mentioned, they don't have to deal with the SEC. Now, if they have issued bonds to investors, then yeah, they probably have to file some sort of paperwork, but still not going to be to the same extent as the public companies. But just because, now, if you are already putting two and two together, you probably have already deduced that there is, we can always find out what's going on in a public company because of the SEC. With private companies, you may think it's really tough to get any information about them. It does require maybe some more digging, but there are still ways to find out the information about private companies. For instance, private companies have to incorporate themselves with the state in which they are operating. So usually it's the Secretary of State's office or some sort of regulatory agency that operates. Okay, and then also most businesses are regulated in some form by a state agency. It probably depends on their field, maybe a licensing agency or something like that. Or they could be also regulated by a federal agency. So for instance, most of your maybe hospitals as well as maybe some industries, they're going to be regulated in part by Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Okay, so you can always find out information about them through that. It won't always be financials, but sometimes it's still good information and onto which you can discover maybe some issues or problems or maybe some newsworthy aspects that maybe have not been relayed to you. Now, private companies often expand, and sometimes they can expand into public companies, especially if they decide they want to go public. Then they have to do what we call an IPO. And I'm going to get to all of that in a second. I'm actually getting ahead of myself. But how do private companies really expand? Well, let's say we have a small store, but we want to make it grow. To make it grow, that requires money. And rather than maybe going to the bank, we're going to ask investors to do this. Okay? So we might first go to investment firms that invest in small operations. And this is then what's called as venture capital funding. Okay? These venture capital firms, they give private companies money. And sometimes it's up in the millions. And they give them this money to expand. Okay? Now, in return, the owners of the private companies, they give that venture capital firm an ownership stake in their business. Okay? So let's say we have, just to put it on a small scale, let's say we have we have received $50,000 in investments, and let's say 40,000 of it came from a venture capital firm, another 10,000 came from a friend of ours. Well, the venture capital firm is going to have the most ownership stake in that business. Okay, they have really a large chunk of it. Now, a lot of times that firm is going to sit on its investment in a private company for 5 to 7 years. And then what they'll do is they'll sell it to another investor. Or they might sell its stake in the company to public investors in what I referred to earlier as an IPO, which is initial public offering. In other words, then they decide to make that private business a public business. Okay? Now, private companies try to sell their businesses to investors in much the same way that public companies do when selling their stock to the public. Okay? So it's still the same process. Some of the neat stories that can come from all of this. If a private business does get an investment from a firm, it can be a story. And these are the questions we have to ask, because if that occurs, does that mean maybe in 5 to 7 years it might go public? But until then, what is that company going to do with the money? In other words, they're wanting to expand, but to where? To do what? How much? How many more people might be employed? You know, there are a lot of questions when businesses decide to grow larger. Private companies also can also sell shares to their employees. So just know that. Sometimes you might see this. I'm trying to think. I think Save-A-Lot grocery stores, I think at one time it was an employee-owned. Your IGA grocery stores are employee-owned. So some of the employees might have some shares in that business. Another place to get some good business information, stories, or just basic information is Chamber of Commerce. It's a place where you can meet business people from all kinds of companies, public and private. You know, they have various events, networking opportunities. You will find, really in any community that you live in or to which you travel, private companies are going to outnumber public companies, pretty much. If you even think in the community of Murray and Callaway County, I'm willing to bet that you will probably come up with more examples of private companies than you will public. So when we write business-related stories, some of these guidelines you're probably going to use in your stories that you will write from your business current events, okay? Because you will have to put together your own news story. If you come across stories or a current event that involves numbers, just know that behind every number there is a story. Okay, so that's where we've got to get to the root of, not just reporting the numbers, but behind the numbers. So if you read a story that gives earnings in the second quarter, and then you notice that the same time period a year ago, the earnings went down, that's a question to ask. Why? Why did they go down? Why did that number go down? Okay, so this is providing context for the reader. Remember, we always have to keep the audience in mind, always our reader. That's why I consider it always to be the most important news criterion. Always use simple words. And this is not just for business journalism. This is in everything you do. I cover education on a freelance basis, and even educators like to throw out all this jargon. And I have to then basically dissect it into relatable information for my readers. They're not going to care what the state testing system is called. We just call it the state testing system, okay? So avoid any type of company jargon. Just avoid jargon, period. For instance, companies are really notable when they have to let some employees go. They'll call it a reduction in force or a workforce reduction. Good golly, it's called firings or layoffs, okay? There's no need to try to pepper it into something that it's not. A reduction in force, don't use those types of terms. Be simple. So many people were fired. Okay, that's the way we have to report it. Use as few numbers as possible. If you ever read a sports story, the sports reporters, they know how to tell a story. They don't use a bunch of numbers. Even though they have stats galore, they don't use a lot of those numbers in their stories. Why? Because the reader is going to get lost and not want to read it, just as much as you as a news reporter really, you don't want to deal with numbers. Same thing with the reader. You have to use as few numbers as possible. We just use the most important numbers. But even then, we sprinkle those throughout the story. We don't use a whole lot of them. Think about the impact the topic of the story will have on readers. Okay, so if we know that a local company is getting ready to expand, maybe they're adding a new product assembly line or something to their plant. Wow, that means more jobs. So we need to find out how many more jobs for the community. How much could that boost the local economy? What's that going to do for the area's unemployment rate? See if you can get comments along those lines. Think what you would want to know if you were an employee or a consumer, for instance. And this is kind of getting to the heart of it. It's news that you can use. That's really what readers want today. They want news that they can use. That's the information they want. Okay, so that is it for business journalism. So you're probably wondering, okay, how do I really put together a business current event story? We are going to use a tool. It's a digital tool, and it's really popular, I think, on a personal level as well as it is seen in the public relations arena, and that is called Photobabble. Now, let me mention a caveat to this Photobabble. Sometimes the website is not the greatest. A lot of times they're doing updates, or sometimes it's hard to log in. I'm going to go ahead and say your first deadline on this first one, if you looked at your course outline, you might have noticed I have the first one due Friday, February 13. That's not going to be possible. So I'm going to extend that to Sunday, November 15. But do not wait until Saturday night to try and do it. Yes, I know your deadline is Sunday, February 15th, 5 p.m. However, Again, and I stress this because a lot of students have indicated, well, if that's my deadline, then I should be able to do it 30 minutes beforehand. Well, no, you really shouldn't, because you're not going to just take a story off of a newspaper or off a news website and read it. No, you've got to write your own. Okay, so that means you might have to compile information from several different news sources. There is a way I can check that. So just make sure you are not just pulling a story and reading it off someplace else. So you'll have to compile that information. The second issue involved is, like I said, sometimes photobabble can be unpredictable. It's still a good tool, but it does have its limitations. So you're going to have to make sure that you're not waiting until Saturday night or 30 minutes before deadline Sunday afternoon to do your assignment. In past classes, I used to do this every week. I think that tired students out, and I think for this online delivery, it would do the same. So that's why you'll see the current news assignments not every week. They're still frequent throughout the semester, but at least not on a weekly basis. Anyway, I will be posting those directions. They are step-by-step directions as to how to do this photobabble assignment. So basically what you're doing, you choose a photo that's related to your story. Now, let's just walk this through a little bit. Let's say that Apple has unveiled a new product. Of course, they've already done their new product unveilings, but just for the sake of explanation here, let me just kind of run through this. Let's say Apple has unveiled a new product, and you want to, do that for this week's current event news assignment. Absolutely, because that's related to business journalism. And you can go ahead and start researching that a little bit and then pulling together a story. So you will then find a photo that's related. Maybe there's a photo of the product that they unveiled. So you can just you can drag that off onto your desktop, and then you start recording your script over the photo. The script should be really no more than 60 seconds. Okay, so you're going to have to be pretty tight in this reporting. Photobabble allows you to record up to, I think, a couple of minutes, but still, I think ideally your story needs to be no longer than 60 seconds, so no longer than 1 minute. Okay. And then that's basically, and then once you record it and you're satisfied with it, there will be a link, a URL link that then you can share with me. Now, in the past, with other classes I've had on site, we would post them to a class blog, and then on Thursdays or before Thursday, I would pick the top 5, and then we'd listen to the top 5, then the students would vote. I think with online delivery, that'll be more challenging, so I'm just going to have you send me the URL pretty much to your photobabble story. Again, I'm going to have all those directions step by step. However, if you have any difficulties or you have any problems, then let me know. But again, and I stress, do not wait until the last minute to do these assignments. Okay, it would be in your best interest not to do that. Have a great week. I hope this has been enlightening for you. Like I've said, some students have really responded well to business journalism. They were glad to have a little bit of knowledge on this. So I hope you have that. You have that as well. Again, email me if you have any questions, or you can call me. Have a great week.